The War of the Fifth Coalition was fought in the year 1809 by a coalition of the Austrian Empire and the United Kingdom against Napoleon's French Empire and Bavaria. Major engagements between France and Austria, the main participants, unfolded over much of Central Europe from April to July, with very high casualty rates for both sides. Britain, already involved on the European continent in the ongoing Peninsular War, sent another expedition, the Walcheren campaign, to the Netherlands in order to relieve the Austrians, although this effort had little impact on the outcome of the conflict. After much campaigning in Bavaria and across the Danube Valley, the war ended favorably for the French after the bloody struggle at Wagram in early July. The resulting Treaty of Schönbrunn was the harshest that France had imposed on Austria in recent memory. Metternich and Archduke Charles had the preservation of the Habsburg Empire as their fundamental goal, and to this end the former succeeded in making Napoleon seek more modest goals in return for promises of Franco-Austrian peace and friendship. Nevertheless, while most of the hereditary lands remained part of Habsburg territories, France received Carinthia, Carniola, and the Adriatic ports, while Galicia was given to the Poles and the Salzburg area of the Tyrol went to the Bavarians. Austria lost over 3 million subjects, about one-fifth of her total population, as a result of these territorial changes. Although the Iberian Peninsular War continued, the War of the Fifth Coalition was the last major conflict on the European continent until the French invasion of Russia in 1812 sparked the Sixth Coalition. Background: Europe had been embroiled in warfare, pitting revolutionary France against a series of coalitions, nearly continuously since 1792. After 5 years of war, the French Republic subdued the First Coalition in 1797. A second coalition was formed in 1798, only to be defeated. In March 1802, France and Great Britain, its one remaining enemy, agreed to end hostilities under the Treaty of Amiens. For the first time in 10 years, all of Europe was at peace. However, many disagreements between the two sides remained unresolved, and implementing the agreements they had reached at Amiens seemed to be a growing challenge. Britain resented having to turn over all of its colonial conquests since 1793, when France was permitted to retain most of its conquered territory in Europe. France, meanwhile, was upset that British troops had not evacuated the island of Malta. In May 1803, Britain declared war on France. Third Coalition. With the resumption of hostilities, Napoleon planned an invasion of England, spending the better part of the next 2 years on this objective. In December 1804, an Anglo-Swedish agreement led to the creation of the Third Coalition. British Prime Minister William Pitt spent 1804 and 1805 in a flurry of diplomatic activity geared towards forming a new coalition against France and neutralizing the threat of invasion. Mutual suspicion between the British and the Russians eased in the face of several French political mistakes, and by April 1805, the two had signed a treaty of alliance. Alarmed by Napoleon's consolidation of northern Italy into a kingdom under his rule, and keen on revenge for having been defeated twice in recent memory by France, Austria would join the coalition a few months later. In August 1805, the French Grande Armée invaded the German states, in hopes of knocking Austria out of the war before Russian forces could intervene. On the 25th of September, after great secrecy and feverish marching, 200,000 French troops began to cross the Rhine on a front of 160 miles. Mack had gathered the greater part of the Austrian army at the fortress of Ulm in Bavaria. Napoleon hoped to swing his forces northward and perform a wheeling movement that would find the French at the Austrian rear. The Ulm maneuver was well executed, and on the 20th of October Mack and 23,000 Austrian troops surrendered at Ulm, bringing the total number of Austrian prisoners in the campaign to 60,000. The French captured Vienna in November and went on to inflict a decisive defeat on a Russo-Austrian army at Austerlitz in early December. Austerlitz led to the expulsion of Russian troops from Central Europe and the humiliation of Austria, which signed the Treaty of Pressburg on the 26th of December. Fourth Coalition Austerlitz incited a major shift in the European balance of power. Prussia felt threatened about her security in the region and, alongside Russia, went to war against France as part of the Fourth Coalition in 1806. 180,000 French troops invaded Prussia in the fall of 1806 through the Thuringian Forest, unaware of where the Prussians were, and hugged the right bank of the Saale River and the left of the Elster. The decisive actions took place on the 14th of October. With an army of 90,000, Napoleon crushed Hohenlohe at Jena, but Davout, commander of the Third Corps, outdid everyone when his 27,000 troops held off and defeated the 63,000 Prussians under Brunswick and King Frederick William III at the Battle of Auerstadt. A vigorous French pursuit through northern Germany finished off the remnants of the Prussian army. The French then invaded Poland, which had been partitioned among Prussia, Austria, and Russia in 1795, to meet the Russian forces that had not been able to save Prussia. The Russian and French armies met in February 1807 at the savage and indecisive Battle of Eylau, which left behind between 30,000 and 50,000 casualties. Napoleon regrouped his forces after the battle and continued to pursue the Russians in upcoming months. The action in Poland finally culminated on the 14th of June 1807, when the French mauled their Russian opponents at the Battle of Friedland. The resulting Treaty of Tilsit in July ended 2 years of bloodshed and left France as the dominant power on the European continent. It also severely weakened Prussia and formed a Franco-Russian axis designed to resolve disputes among European nations. Iberia Peninsula. After the War of the Oranges, Portugal adopted a double policy. On the one hand, John, Prince of Brazil, as regent of Portugal, signed the Treaty of Badajoz with France and Spain, by which he assumed the duty to close the ports to British trade. On the other hand, not wanting to breach the Treaty of Windsor with Portugal's oldest ally, Britain, he allowed for such trade to continue and maintained secret diplomatic relations with them. However, after the Franco-Spanish defeat in the Battle of Trafalgar, John grew bold and officially resumed diplomatic and trade relations with Britain. Unhappy with this change of policy of the Portuguese government, Napoleon sent an army to invade Portugal. On the 17th of October 1807, 24,000 French troops under General Junot crossed the Pyrenees with Spanish cooperation and headed towards Portugal to enforce Napoleon's continental system. This was the first step in what would become the 6-year-long Peninsular War, a struggle that sapped much of the French Empire's strength. Throughout the winter of 1808, French agents became increasingly involved in Spanish internal affairs, attempting to incite discord between members of the Spanish royal family. On the 16th of February 1808, secret French machinations finally materialized when Napoleon announced that he would intervene to mediate between the rival political factions in the Spanish royal family. Marshal Murat led 120,000 troops into Spain, and the French arrived in Madrid on the 24th of March, where wild riots against the occupation erupted a few weeks later. The resistance to French aggression soon spread throughout the country. The shocking French defeat at the Battle of Bailén in July gave hope to Napoleon's enemies and partly persuaded the French emperor to intervene in person. A new French army commanded by Napoleon crossed the Ebro in autumn and dealt blow after blow to the opposing Spanish forces. Napoleon entered Madrid on the 4th of December with 80,000 troops. He then unleashed his troops against Moore's British forces. The British were swiftly driven to the coast, and, after a last stand at the Battle of Corunna in January 1809, withdrew from Spain entirely. Austria stands alone. Austria sought another confrontation with France to avenge the recent defeats, and the developments in Spain only encouraged its attitudes. Austria could not count on Russian support because the latter was at war with Britain, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire in 1809. Frederick William III of Prussia initially promised to help Austria, but reneged before conflict began. The British had been at war with the French Empire for 6 years. A report from the Austrian finance minister suggested that the treasury would run out of money by mid-1809 if the large army that the Austrians had formed since the Third Coalition remained mobilized. Although Charles warned that the Austrians were not ready for another showdown with Napoleon, a stance that landed him amidst the so-called Peace Party, he did not want to see the army demobilized. On 8 February 1809, the advocates for war finally succeeded when the imperial government secretly decided to make war against France. Austrian reforms Austerlitz and the subsequent Treaty of Pressburg in 1805 indicated that the Austrian army needed reform. Napoleon had offered Charles the Austrian throne after Austerlitz, an act that aroused deep suspicion from Charles's brother, Austrian Emperor Francis II. Even though Charles was allowed to spearhead the reforms of the Austrian army, Francis kept the Hofkriegsrat, a military advisory board, to oversee the activities of Charles as supreme commander. In 1806, Charles issued a new guide for army and unit tactics. The main tactical innovation was the concept of the mass, an anti-cavalry formation created by closing up the spacing between ranks. However, Austrian commanders disliked the innovation and rarely used it unless directly supervised by Charles. Following the failures at Ulm and Austerlitz, the Austrians went back to using the 6 companies per battalion model, abandoning the 4-company per battalion that had been introduced by Mack on the eve of war in 1805. Problems persisted despite the reforms. The Austrians lacked sufficient skirmishers to successfully contend with their French counterparts. The cavalry was often sprinkled into individual units throughout the army, preventing the shock and hitting power evident in the French system. And even though Charles imitated the French corps command structure, leaders in the Austrian military establishment were often wary of taking the initiative, relying heavily on written orders and drawn-out planning before they came to a decision. Another reform was that Austria, having lost many officers, veteran and elite troops, and regulars, and unable to call on allies, embraced the levée en masse used earlier by the French. By this time, the French were moving from the levée en masse in favor of forming a regular army based on a corps of battle-hardened and elite veterans, in a strange reversal of the earlier Napoleonic Wars, where Frenchmen with little experience and often pressed into service fought against the professional Austrian army. A massive amount of Austrian conscripts, with no experience and only basic training and equipment, would be sent into the field against a highly trained, campaign-hardened, and well-equipped French Grande Armée EQT. Austrian preparations. Charles and the Aulic Council were divided about the strategy with which to attack the French. Charles wanted a major thrust from Bohemia designed to isolate the French forces in northern Germany and lead to a rapid decision. The greater part of the Austrian army was already concentrated there, so it seemed like a natural operation. The Aulic Council disagreed on account of the Danube River, splitting the forces of Charles and his brother John. They instead suggested that the main attack should be launched south of the Danube so as to maintain safer communications with Vienna. In the end, they had their way, but not before precious time had been lost. The Austrian plan called for the Bohemian Corps, the I under Bella Garda, consisting of 38,000 troops, and the 2 of 20,000 troops under Colowrat. to attack Regensburg from the Bohemian Mountains by way of Cham, the Austrian centre and reserve, comprising 66,000 men of Hohenzollerns III, Rosenberg's IV, and Liechtenstein's 1st Reserve Corps, to advance on the same objective through Scharding, and the left wing, made up of the VIAF Archduke Louis, Hillersvii, and Kienmayer's 2nd Reserve Corps, a total of 61,000 men, to move forward toward Landshut and guard the flank. Congressive effort at Tilsit. Napoleon had made Alexander of Russia an admirer, but by the time of the Erfurt Congress from September to October 1808, anti-French sentiment at the Russian court was beginning to threaten the newly forged alliance. Napoleon and his foreign minister Jean-Baptiste Nompere de Champagny sought to reaffirm the alliance once more in order to allow Napoleon to settle affairs in Spain, as well as prepare for the looming war with Austria. Working at cross purposes to Napoleon was his former foreign minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord, who had by this time come to the conclusion that Napoleon and his war policies were leading France to destruction, and who secretly advised Alexander to resist Napoleon's demands. Out of the meetings came an agreement, the Erfurt Convention, calling upon Britain to cease its war against France, recognizing the Russian conquest of Finland from Sweden, and stating that in case of war with Austria, Russia should aid France to the best of its ability. The two emperors departed for their homelands on October 14. 6 months later, the expected war with Austria began, and Alexander barely lived up to his agreement, aiding France as little as possible. By 1810, due mainly to the economic pressures of enforcing the continental system, both emperors were considering war with one another. Erfurt was the last meeting between the two leaders. French preparations. Napoleon was not entirely certain about Austrian planning and intentions. He had just returned to Paris at the time and was instructing the main French field commander in southern Germany, Berthier, on planned deployments and concentrations for this likely new second front. His rough ideas about the possible upcoming campaign included the decision to make the Danube Valley the main theatre of operations, as he had done in 1805, and to tie down any Austrian forces that might invade northern Italy by positioning some of his own forces that would be commanded by Eugene in Marmont. Faulty intelligence gave Napoleon the impression that the main Austrian attack would come north of the Danube. On the 30th of March, he wrote a letter to Berthier explaining his intention to mass around 140,000 troops in the vicinity of Regensburg, far to the north of where the Austrians were planning to make their attack. Napoleon also expected the Austrian offensive to commence no earlier than the 15th of April, and his two contingency orders relayed to Berthier were based heavily on this supposition. These misconceptions about Austrian thinking left the French army poorly deployed when hostilities commenced.